Welcome to another episode of the brand called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a senior and accomplished airline pilot from London, UK, Mr. Shaun Lang. Shaun, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Shaun, as I mentioned, is an airline captain. So, Shaun, you grew up moving across countries because of your father's military career. How did that shape your worldview?
I think as a child living in a foreign country, you don't realize it at the time, but certainly growing up, you begin to understand maybe the value that presents to you as an adult. You're able to integrate with other members of society,
Mhm,
cultures, etc. And certainly when they don't speak your language, communication is quite difficult in terms of talking. So
mhm.
you find other ways to interact with children and play games, etc. So I was very grateful for that.
Hmm. And when did you learn from being raised primarily by your father and what did you learn primarily from your father and your grandfather who raised you?
Yeah, so my mother passed away at an early age. So being raised by my father primarily, I think as a parent now, I understand the challenges that must have presented to him being a solo parent. So
Mm,
incredibly grateful for the effort and time that he managed to take. And living predominantly with my grandfather as well, I feel with generationally, we probably see that the generation above and above that probably hold things in different regards. So I think the sense of respect and principles that I held myself to now were probably primarily from my grandfather. So yeah, that's probably the main thing in the sense of respect and that generational
amazing.
difference that we
Yeah,
see.
yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. When did the idea of becoming a pilot first become a serious ambition for you?
Well, it was always an ambition as a young child. My father raised me, although he was a pilot in the army, he saw that being a pilot in the RAF would be a far better option. So he's raised me from a very young age to want to do that. In terms of serious ambition, I would probably say once you get to that school age where you're starting to do exams and their results are dependent on whether you're eligible to apply. So 12, 13 years old, perhaps, that's when you first start to realize that,
Mm.
okay, my effort here is going to define whether I'm going to achieve those goals that I've set for myself. So it starts to focus the mind quite a bit.
How interesting. When I was reading about you, I was fascinated to learn that you were rejected twice before being accepted into the Royal Air Force. What kept you going?
Well, primarily it was my ambition to be a pilot in the RAF. I
Mhm.
think no matter what your ambitions are, if you're driven enough to really want to achieve it, nothing will stop you. So
Mm.
I guess from a young age, as I say, it was an ambition and there wasn't really so much of a backup plan. So although it was my primary goal, the first time being rejected at 18, I was quite inexperienced in life, which isn't going to help generally. The second time I was made an offer for a job that I didn't particularly want to do. It was more of a backup plan within the RAF. And given that I had the third option to apply again as a pilot, that was my ambition. So if I'm given that option, that's what I want to take and therefore
Mhm.
turned their offer down and yeah,
How
applied a third
interesting.
time.
How interesting. What did your time in the Territorial Army teach you that uh, later helped in aviation?
Well, I joined the Territorial Army as a fusilier or equivalent of private. So it's really the lowest rung on the ladder. And,
Mhm.
you know, you're bottom of the food chain. You're just told where to be at what time. My time later as a pilot in the RAF, I was a commissioned officer. So a few rungs higher on the ladder, and you're
Mhm.
therefore expected to give the information to people. So I think having seen it from both sides, I was lucky enough to be able to perhaps think about how to present information to people. What do they need to know? What
Mhm.
timings, equipment, etc. What you're responsible for them as well as yourself. So having seen it from both sides, as I say, I can perhaps put myself in a slightly better position to be able to present that information to people effectively.
Mhm. And you also served in Iraq, which must have been quite an amazing and intense experience. What were some of the biggest personal lessons you took away from that tough period that you served in?
Yeah, I think it was very much day by day for 6 months. So you didn't really, although tasking wise, you were given a plan, you didn't really make plans yourself. It was just kind of react to events as such. The main thing I think really, whilst I was there, was certainly, as you say, a high pressure environment.
Yeah.
Humor, sense of humor is so important to be able to deal with stress and boredom and frustration. So I would never underestimate the value of humor in all situations, really, its effectiveness to solve problems. And I think primarily coming home, I remember one scenario. I finished my tour, gone back to my daytime job of stacking shelves in a supermarket, and I was presented with a lady that wanted some food for her cat, which we didn't have in stock. So she became quite angry and was having a go at me in the aisle about not having this cat food in stock. And I remember thinking that a month or two before, I was walking around the streets of Basra with a machine gun, trying not to get shot or blown up. And now this is the biggest problem for me. So
Okay.
I think it really focuses the mind in terms of, does this situation warrant an overreaction? Can I move on with this? Can I deal with it? So that I'm quite grateful for, in the sense of being able to prioritize stress.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. You also flew the VC-10 aircraft, which required a four-person cockpit. How did that influence teamwork and communication?
Yeah, again, it was my first tour in the Royal Air Force. So as a very young junior pilot, I just kind of reacting to events. You do what you're told, and when you're told. So looking back on it, you become aware of the impact that it has on you and the effectiveness of communication, how important that is. So in any abnormal situations, with four people in a confined environment, communication is going to be quite important. And in that situation, you'd be required as the co-pilot sitting front right to communicate with the navigator sitting rear left. And then the captain would speak with the flight engineer, who were diagonally opposite each other. So you've got two sets of conversations crossing over each other there. And as I say, the importance of communication, knowing when to speak, when not to speak, listening for information that might be getting put out into the ether that is of relevance to you. And you have to take that in and adjust your plan accordingly, or things like that. So yeah, communication was very important, and certainly something that I've taken forwards from then.
Amazing. How did your experience in Afghanistan and Libya after Iraq shape your understanding of responsibility and risk?
Well, these were obviously from a flying point of view rather than being on the ground, so considerably different in that sense. And both of those tours I saw both as a co-pilot and as captain of the aircraft. So as a co-pilot, although you are second in command on the aircraft, you're primarily responsible for flying and being in the right place at the right time. Later on, when I became a captain, you see that from a wider perspective, in the sense of, where do you need to be at what time, and what are the impacts of any changes to that plan? Yeah. So you're thinking as a much broader perspective from the left-hand seat.
Amazing. When you first became a captain on the Airbus A330 Voyager, what changed mentally for you, and how was it to move from military aircraft to a commercial aircraft?
Yeah, as I think I've just touched on there, the sense of thinking outside of the box, so to speak. As a captain, you're thinking more further down the line, not just how do I deal with this little problem in-house, this abnormal situation on the aircraft. What are the implications going forward? Is it going to affect the tasking that you have? The fighters might not get the fuel they need. All those kind of things further down the line. In terms of militarily and commercially, the difference really, I suppose, is money. The impact that any changes to the plan have commercially can have a big knock-on effect for several hundred passengers, and the cost to the company if plans change, if you divert somewhere, put them in hotels, or the impact to crew hours, not being able to continue the flight, etc. So there's a far bigger sense of the monetary impact commercially than there is militarily. But that being said, militarily, there's the operational picture, which has a far bigger impact for changes.
Correct, correct. So you do have the challenge from some irate passengers, don't you?
Yeah, of course, that's part of day-to-day life. But thankfully, we have fantastic crew that manage to deal with that.
Absolutely, well said. How different is the culture between military and civilian aviation environments?
On the aircraft, not very different at all. It's a team of people that are there to get an aircraft safely from A to B. So in that sense, very similar. I think the environments we work in are significantly different. So taking troops in and out of Afghanistan, for instance, and having to stay there during the layover is slightly different to perhaps treating yourself to 24 hours in New York and enjoying the sights and sounds. So I think also managing the crew in those situations, it can be quite stressful for new joiners. You know, they're going to operational theatre and the risks associated with that. It's important that you speak to people and they feel comfortable and safe doing it.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that was a big side of the military bit. But in terms of an in-house team, yeah, it's a team of 8, 10, 12 people that want to get the job done safely.
Amazing. There's another very interesting change in your career during COVID. You transitioned to truck driving
Hmm.
during COVID after losing your job.
Yeah.
What did that experience teach you about humility and adaptability? And how did this happen from a big airline to driving a truck?
Well, I think unfortunately, my particular company they had to take the financial decision to lay off some pilots in order to survive as a company, which I totally understand. That's part of business. Obviously, airlines around the world had
Yeah.
to make similar changes. So that was where I found myself unemployed. And a very good friend of mine had actually recommended at the time HGV training as an option, given that the UK was short of truck drivers. So I chose to go down that route. I was fortunate enough to get my license and then taken on by a local company. So although the boss knew of my background, the other 5 or 6 drivers, quite a small company, weren't aware until I got to know them and we talked about things. So, I was very grateful for the opportunity to do it. And it really focuses the mind in the sense of you're completely taken off your feet from what you're familiar with and you're put in a completely new environment with different hours, different responsibilities. And I must say, I've got a lot of respect for people that do that as a career because I struggled with the 3:30, 4:30 in the morning starts, and driving an 18-ton flatbed through the center of London was quite terrifying.
I agree. But a few minutes back, you were telling me after your Air Force career, you were stacking shelves.
Yeah.
And then, you were flying this huge aircraft, the A330, and then you lost your job and you started uh, driving trucks. I mean, I think I have a lot of admiration to someone like you who was just changing from being this very high profile airline pilot to stacking shelves and driving a truck. How did you adjust to this mentally?
I think in life it's important to be adaptable, really, because if you can't, you're going to create unnecessary stress for yourself. And yeah, I suppose there was a level of humility required there in terms of going from quite a high profile job, which I was very fortunate to have, to what would be perhaps more routine, classed as more routine as a truck driver. But as I say, that the people that do that have their own levels of reward, responsibility, and risk that you just fit in with. And I was very new to it, so it took me a while to adapt and get used to it. But it's the same as any job, really. They need you to be at a certain place at a certain time with a certain load, which arguably is very similar to flying a plane. And it was nice to be able to put myself into that new learning position again, to meet new people, to be in new destinations and have different responsibilities, because it keeps your mind working
Yeah.
and keeps you thinking rather than just being complacent with things. And that's where risk starts to creep in because you don't think about things as actively as perhaps you would as a new environment.
Amazing. And then, the stars started to shine all over again, and you found your way back into aviation and eventually into the cockpit of the Airbus 350. What did the comeback feel like?
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely incredible. I do remember driving in the truck early one morning, it was still dark, and hearing on the news that the first vaccine had been authorized for use. So it felt like the beginning of the end. And I'm sure it was the same for tens of thousands of other people that found themselves in unfortunate positions. But coming back to the company after a year out was incredible. I was so fortunate and so grateful. And, still am to this day, obviously, for the job I get to do. But to know that the finish line was in sight, that I was going to have to get back to the job that I loved doing, that I was fortunate enough to do, it just made you so much more respectful of the opportunity you're given. And again, going back to that earlier situation in the supermarket, it really focuses the mind as to what's important in life and is it worth stressing over things that are outside of your control. So that was a big part of it, and the relief to be back. Yeah, certainly.
Amazing. Few more questions for you. What are the three most critical traits required? And Bish, you've had such an amazing journey to succeed in aviation and in life.
Yeah, I mean, these are my view, of course. Other people might disagree,
Absolutely.
but
Yeah.
respect, I think, is hugely important. I think as I mentioned before, I took that in large from my grandfather.
Mm,
So having respect for the individuals around you that you work with or that you just experience in day-to-day life, you're not going to get very far in life if you don't respect people.
mm,
And leading on from that, I suppose, is the ability to adapt. Things aren't always going to go your way. So you have to be able to take the situation, see it for what it is, and utilize it as best you can. So adaptability, very important in life. And finally, I think the most important thing across all walks of life is
mm,
communication.
mm.
If you can't communicate effectively, everything else becomes exponentially harder in
Correct.
terms of achieving
Correct.
stuff.
Correct. Great response. Time for two more questions for you, Sean. Do setbacks ultimately make better leaders or just tougher individuals? Your view.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Again, very personal, I think, in terms of a response. But yeah, setbacks certainly can make tougher leaders
Mhm.
because I think a decent leader needs to have had experience, and arguably, you're not always going to experience positives and success.
Mm.
Whether it makes them a better leader, no, is the answer if they don't learn from it, because you could keep making the same mistake again and again, and you're not going to be a good leader, clearly. Yeah, but tougher individuals, certainly. I think you have to experience failure in life to understand
Correct.
rejection as I had, or whatever it is, health scares, things like that. It's all part of life, and you have to be able to experience that, adapt, move on, and learn from it,
Yeah.
which will make you a better person.
Very well said. And my last question for you. If a young person viewing our conversation or listening to our conversation today faces repeated rejection, what would you say to them based on your own journey?
Well, I suppose the answer really is within the question, in that it's a journey. Everything is. We have to be grateful for everything we're given in life, be it success, failure. And ultimately, everybody's life is a series of successes and failures and
Absolutely.
rejections. So
Yeah.
I've quite often said that every failure I've had or every rejection in my life, every piece of bad news has led me to the point I'm at today,
Mm.
speaking to you. And I'm very grateful for this situation that I'm in, employment wise, family wise, the ability to speak to people like yourself. So don't be afraid of it. It is part of life. You have to accept it. You have to be able to move on. And if you're ambitious enough, there isn't really much that should be able to stop you. It might not be the way that you want to approach the thing that you're trying to achieve. It might just take a slightly longer route, slightly more time. But if you're ambitious enough, there's nothing that should stop you.
Wow. And on that note, uh, Sean, and that old line of Murphy's Law, which really says anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And yet, your words of wisdom that if you do hit a bad patch, just keep moving along. This too shall pass, as the old line, as the famous line goes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sean, for speaking to me about your own incredible journey. I just love the amount of wisdom you have in everything that you've said and how easily you seem to have transitioned between your peaks and your troughs, between your highs and your lows at a professional career. And what amazing words of wisdom you've been able to share with my viewers and listeners. Thank you for speaking to me and all the very best to you.
It was a great privilege. Thank you for your time, Ashutosh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.